Stories often begin with a lie we learn as children. The lie is simple. Heroes are good, villains are evil. One protects the world, the other wants to destroy it. The hero fights for justice, while the villain fights for chaos. It's a comforting narrative because it makes the world easy to understand. We divide people into categories, draw a clear line between light and darkness, and assume that one side is naturally born different from the other. But the older we get, the harder it becomes to believe that lie. Reality rarely produces pure heroes or pure villains. Instead, it produces something far more unsettling. Ordinary people shaped by extraordinary pain. And sometimes, that pain transforms them into the very thing they once feared. Pain is one of the most powerful forces in the human experience. It changes how we think, how we trust, and how we see the world around us. A child who grows up feeling safe will often assume the world is safe. A child who grows up feeling betrayed will often assume the opposite. Over time, these assumptions become the foundation of a personality. Psychology refers to this process as adaptation. When people experience trauma, their minds begin building defenses to protect them from further harm. Some become emotionally distant, others become hypervigilant, constantly expecting danger, and some develop something darker, the belief that the only way to survive in a cruel world is to become cruel themselves. In many cases, villains are not people who love evil. They are people who learned that kindness did not protect them. One of the most famous examples of this transformation appears in the story of Anakin Skywalker. When we first meet him, he is not a monster. He is a hopeful child with dreams of becoming a hero, but throughout his life, he experiences repeated loss, fear, and manipulation. He watches his mother die. He grows up inside a system that teaches him to suppress his emotions rather than understand them. And most importantly, he becomes terrified of losing the people he loves. Fear of loss slowly consumes him, and that fear is carefully exploited by someone who promises him control over fate. By the time Anakin becomes Darth Vader, he believes he is doing what is necessary to prevent further suffering. In his mind, the villain is not himself. It is the world that forced him into impossible choices. This pattern appears again and again in fiction because it reflects something very real about human psychology. Trauma does not simply disappear when an event ends. It lingers inside memory, reshaping a person's perception of every future situation. A betrayal can turn trust into suspicion. A humiliation can turn insecurity into rage. Over time, these emotional wounds can accumulate until they begin to redefine a person's identity. Instead of asking, what is the right thing to do, the mind begins asking a much simpler question. How do I make sure this never happens to me again? When survival becomes the highest priority, morality often becomes negotiable. The character of Eric Killmonger in Black Panther illustrates this idea with uncomfortable clarity. Killmonger is not driven by random cruelty or mindless destruction. His motivations come from a lifetime of abandonment, injustice, and witnessing suffering inflicted upon people who looked like him. He grows up surrounded by violence and inequality, and he interprets the world through that experience. By the time he confronts Wakanda, he believes he is correcting a historic wrong. His methods are brutal, but his anger is understandable. The audience is placed in an uneasy position. We recognize that his actions are dangerous, yet we also recognize that his pain is real. The story forces us to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes villains are not created by personal weakness, but by environments that reward anger more than compassion. Pain also has another psychological effect. It narrows our perspective. When people suffer long enough, their world becomes smaller. Empathy begins to erode because the mind becomes consumed with its own survival. Neuroscientists have found that chronic stress alters how the brain processes threat and reward. The amygdala becomes more reactive, while areas responsible for long-term reasoning become less influential. In simple terms, pain pushes people toward faster, harsher decisions. The villain may not wake up one day and decide to become evil. Instead, they make dozens of small decisions driven by fear, resentment, or desperation, until eventually they look back and realize they have crossed a line they can no longer return from. The Joker represents perhaps the most disturbing version of this transformation. Unlike many villains, his story is not about power or conquest. It is about humiliation, neglect, and the slow collapse of a person who feels invisible to society. In the 2019 film, Arthur Fleck is a man struggling with mental illness, poverty, and constant rejection. He is mocked by strangers, ignored by institutions meant to help him, and treated like a nuisance by the world around him. None of these events alone create the Joker, but together they form a psychological pressure that keeps building until something finally breaks. When Arthur embraces the Joker identity, he is not simply choosing chaos, he is rejecting a society he believes rejected him first. What makes this transformation so unsettling is how familiar it feels. Most people have experienced some form of rejection, betrayal, or injustice. We understand the emotions that lead someone down a darker path. The difference is not always in the feeling itself, but in how that feeling is processed. Some people channel pain into growth, resilience, or creativity. Others allow it to evolve into bitterness and revenge. The line between these outcomes can be incredibly thin, shaped by support systems, personal beliefs, and sometimes pure chance. This is why the most memorable villains are rarely those who are purely evil. They are the ones who reflect a distorted version of something deeply human. Magneto from X-Men believes that persecution will inevitably return, so he chooses domination as a form of protection. Walter White from Breaking Bad begins with the understandable desire to provide for his family, but gradually allows pride and resentment to consume him. These characters do terrible things, yet audiences remain fascinated by them because we can trace the emotional path that led them there. Their actions are horrifying, but their motivations are understandable. Pain can also reshape how people interpret justice. When someone feels that the world has treated them unfairly, they may begin to believe that traditional rules no longer apply to them. Philosophers sometimes refer to this as moral disengagement, the process of convincing oneself that harmful actions are justified under certain circumstances. History is filled with examples of individuals who committed atrocities while believing they were serving a higher cause. In their minds, they were not villains. They were necessary forces correcting an unjust world. This perspective is deeply uncomfortable because it challenges the comforting idea that villains are fundamentally different from everyone else. If villains were simply born evil, the problem would be easy to solve. But when villains are created through suffering, the situation becomes far more complicated. It forces us to ask difficult questions about responsibility, empathy, and the systems that shape human behavior. At the same time, acknowledging the role of pain does not excuse cruelty. Understanding why someone becomes a villain is not the same as forgiving what they do. Pain explains behavior, but it does not erase consequences. In fact, many stories emphasize this tension. A villain may have legitimate grievances, yet their response ultimately creates more suffering than the original injustice. The tragedy lies in the realization that their pain could have led to a different path. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this idea is how ordinary the beginning usually is. Villains rarely start their journey with grand ambitions of destruction. They begin with smaller emotions: anger, fear, humiliation, loneliness. These feelings are universal. Everyone carries some version of them. What separates the hero from the villain is often not the presence of pain, but the direction that pain takes. Some people transform suffering into empathy. Others transform it into power. And once that transformation begins, it can become incredibly difficult to reverse. In the end, pain does not automatically create villains, but it creates the conditions where villainy can grow. It plants the seeds of resentment, mistrust, and anger. Whether those seeds become wisdom or destruction depends on the choices people make and the environments that shape those choices. This is why villains remain such a powerful part of storytelling. They remind us that darkness rarely appears out of nowhere. It develops slowly, quietly, often disguised as survival or justice. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all is this: every villain believes they are the hero of their own story, which means the real danger is not evil people. The real danger is pain that is never understood.